Everyone thought Elara was losing her mind when her dog refused to cross the old stone bridge. They told her she was being irrational, that she was seeing problems where none existed. But when she finally looked underneath, what she discovered sent shockwaves through the entire valley and changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The ordinary world. The mountain town of Ravenhollow sat cradled between two peaks in the Whispering Range, a place where morning mist clung to the valleys like cotton and the air always carried the scent of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of town that appeared on no major maps, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where tradition ran as deep as the roots of the ancient oaks that lined its narrow streets. Elara Finch had called Ravenhollow home for nearly 15 years. She had arrived as a young woman fleeing the chaos of Portland, seeking solitude and a connection to the wild that the city could never offer. Now, at 38, she had carved out a life that suited her completely. She worked as a wilderness tracker and hunting guide, one of only 3 in the region, and the only woman. Her clients were mostly out-of-towners, wealthy folks from Seattle or Vancouver who wanted authentic mountain experiences but lacked the skills to navigate the unforgiving terrain on their own. Elara didn't mind the work. In fact, she thrived in it. She knew every trail within 50 miles, every creek crossing, every ridge where elk gathered at dawn. She could read weather patterns in the movement of clouds, track a wounded deer through dense underbrush by the faintest droplets of blood, and navigate by starlight when her compass failed. The mountains had taught her patience, resilience, and respect for the natural order of things. She lived in a modest cabin on the eastern edge of town, a structure she'd renovated herself over the years. It had a stone fireplace, large windows facing the forest, and a covered porch where she spent her evenings watching the sun sink behind Thornback Ridge. Her only companion was a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois named Casper, a dog she'd raised from a pup and trained for tracking work. Casper was exceptional. He could follow a scent trail days old, locate lost hikers in blizzard conditions, and remained calm under pressure in ways that constantly impressed even the most experienced outdoorsman Elara worked with. The dog was more than a working animal, he was her partner, her early warning system, and in many ways, her closest friend in a town where she'd always remained somewhat on the outside. Women in Ravenhollow weren't typically guides or trackers. That was men's work, according to the old-timers who gathered at Merrick's Feed and Hardware. Elara had fought for respect inch by inch, proving herself season after season until even the most skeptical locals had to admit she knew her craft. But she was still seen as different, an outsider who chose solitude over socializing, who preferred the company of animals to people. She didn't mind. She had never been one for crowds or gossip. Her life was measured in tracks and trails, in the quiet communion with the wilderness that most people would never understand. The discovery. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the air had turned sharp and frost glazed the meadows each dawn. Elara rose before sunrise as she always did, pulling on her worn boots and heavy flannel jacket. Casper was already awake, sitting by the door with the patient alertness of a dog who knew the routine by heart. They set out together on their usual morning route, a 6-mile loop that took them through the lower forest trails and across Ember Creek via the old Graythorn Bridge. The bridge was a relic from the logging era, built sometime in the 1920s from massive slabs of quarried stone and thick timber beams. It spanned a narrow gorge where Ember Creek rushed 30 feet below, carving its way through moss-covered rocks. The structure was solid, reinforced multiple times over the decades, and used daily by hikers, hunters, and locals cutting through to the northern trailheads. Elara had crossed that bridge hundreds, maybe thousands of times. It was as familiar to her as her own front door. But on this particular morning, everything changed. As they approached the bridge, Casper trotted ahead as he always did, nose low to the ground, tail relaxed. But when they were about 20 feet from the bridge entrance, the dog stopped cold. His ears pinned back flat against his skull. His entire body went rigid, muscles tensing beneath his sleek coat. "Casper?" Elara called, her breath misting in the cold air. "Come on, boy." The dog didn't move. Instead, he backed up 3 slow steps, his eyes locked on the bridge with an intensity that made the hair on Elara's neck prickle. A low, guttural whine escaped his throat, a sound she'd only heard once before, when they'd stumbled upon a fresh mountain lion kill. Elara stopped and studied the bridge carefully. Nothing looked out of place. The stones were solid, the wooden railings intact. The creek below gurgled and splashed as it always did. No bears, no cougars, no obvious danger. The forest around them was still and quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that usually meant all was well. "What's wrong?" she murmured, more to herself than to the dog. She stepped forward, placing one boot on the first stone slab of the bridge. It felt solid beneath her weight. She walked several feet onto the bridge, testing each step, listening for any creaking or shifting. Nothing. The structure was as sound as ever. She turned back to Casper. "See? It's fine. Let's go." But Casper wouldn't follow. He took another step backward, whining louder now, his gaze never leaving the bridge. His tail was tucked between his legs, his posture screaming fear, not aggression, not alertness, but pure, instinctive terror. Initial reaction. Elara had worked with dogs her entire adult life. She knew their body language, understood their instincts. And what she was seeing now was something she couldn't easily dismiss. Casper wasn't being stubborn or playful. He was genuinely afraid. She walked back off the bridge and knelt beside him, running her hand along his neck to soothe him. "Easy, boy. Easy." The moment she moved away from the bridge, Casper's demeanor shifted. His ears relaxed slightly. His breathing steadied. But his eyes remained fixed on the stone structure, as if it concealed some invisible threat. Elara tried again. She unclipped the leash from her belt and attached it to Casper's collar, giving a gentle tug. "Come on. We're crossing." Casper dug his claws into the dirt, resisting with every ounce of his considerable strength. When she pulled harder, he yelped, a sharp, pained sound, and thrashed against the leash so violently that Elara had to let go to avoid hurting him. The dog immediately retreated another 10 feet, watching her with wide, anxious eyes. Elara stood there, stunned. In 5 years, Casper had never disobeyed a command. He'd crossed rushing rivers, climbed steep rock faces, navigated thunderstorms without hesitation. But this bridge, a structure he'd crossed countless times before, had suddenly become an impenetrable barrier. Frustrated and deeply unsettled, Elara decided not to force the issue. She turned and led Casper back down the trail, taking the long route around the gorge that added over an hour to their journey. The entire time, she couldn't shake the image of her dog's terrified eyes, the way he'd looked at the bridge as if it were haunted. Community mockery begins. By midday, Elara was in town picking up supplies at Brennan's Market, the only grocery store in Ravenhollow. While loading canned goods into her basket, she ran into Ravenhollow, the postmaster and the town's unofficial gossip hub. "Morning, Elara," Vera said cheerfully, her gray curls bouncing as she examined a display of apples. "How's Casper doing?" "He's fine," Elara replied absently, then added, "Actually, something strange happened this morning. He wouldn't cross the Greythorn Bridge. Just froze up and refused to go near it." Vera's eyebrows shot up. "Really? That's odd. Maybe he smelled a dead animal underneath. You know how sensitive they are." "Maybe," Elara said, though the explanation didn't sit right with her. By evening, the story had made its rounds. Small towns operated on a currency of stories, and an unusual one like this spread fast. At the Copper Antler Tavern that night, Elara overheard 2 local hunters laughing about it. "Did you hear? Elara Finch's wonder dog is scared of bridges now," one man said, loud enough for half the bar to hear. "Maybe he finally figured out what everyone else knows, that woman spends too much time alone in the woods," the other replied, grinning into his whiskey. Laughter rippled through the room. Elara kept her head down, nursing her coffee in a corner booth, but the words stung more than she wanted to admit. She'd worked for years to earn the respect of this town, and in one morning, she'd become the subject of jokes again. Family and inner circle doubt. The following Sunday, Elara visited her cousin Rowan, one of the few family members she still kept in contact with. Rowan lived on a small ranch just outside Ravenhollow with his wife, Iris, and their 3 children. They were good people, practical and grounded, and Elara usually enjoyed their company. Over a lunch of roasted chicken and potatoes, Elara mentioned the bridge incident. Rowan chuckled and shook his head. Dogs do weird things sometimes. Remember when our old hound wouldn't go near the barn for a whole month? Turned out there was a hornet's nest in the rafters. This feels different, Elara said quietly. Iris leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but tinged with concern. Elara, honey, you spend a lot of time alone out there. Sometimes our minds we can start seeing patterns that aren't really there. Maybe Casper just had an off day. Maybe, Elara said, though she didn't believe it. Rowan's oldest son, a teenager named Cole, piped up from across the table. My friend's dad said you're turning into one of those crazy mountain hermits who thinks trees talk to them. Cole! Iris snapped, but the damage was done. Elara forced a smile, finished her meal quickly, and left shortly after. As she drove back to her cabin, she felt the weight of their doubt pressing down on her. They thought she was overreacting. They thought isolation was making her paranoid. Isolation intensifies. Over the next 3 weeks, Elara attempted to cross the Graythorn Bridge 5 more times. Each attempt ended the same way. Casper would approach, freeze, and refuse to go any further. His fear never lessened. If anything, it seemed to intensify. Other dogs crossed the bridge without issue. Hikers walked over it daily. But Casper, the most reliable and fearless dog Elara had ever known, would not set paw on those stones. The mockery in town grew sharper. At Merrick's Feed and Hardware, the owner asked with a smirk if she needed a doggy therapist. At the gas station, teenagers whispered and laughed as she filled her truck. Even Sheriff Drummond, a stern man she'd worked with on several search and rescue operations, pulled her aside one afternoon. Elara, I've known you a long time, he said, his tone gentle but firm. You're a good tracker, but dogs are just animals. They get spooked. Don't let this get in your head. She nodded politely but said nothing. His words, like everyone else's, dismissed what she knew to be true. Something was wrong at that bridge. Commitment despite opposition. But Elara couldn't let it go. Every instinct she'd honed over 15 years in the wilderness told her that Casper's behavior was a warning. Animals didn't act that way without reason. Casper had faced down bears, held steady during thunderstorms, tracked through avalanche zones without flinching. This wasn't random fear. This was something specific, something real. One evening, as darkness settled over Ravenhollow and the first stars blinked to life above the peaks, Elara sat on her porch with Casper lying at her feet. The dog was calm now, his breathing steady, but she couldn't stop replaying that morning, the terror in his eyes, the desperate way he'd pulled away from the bridge. She made a decision. She would go back to the Graythorn Bridge. Not to force Casper across, but to investigate. She would examine every inch of that structure, above, below, around, until she found what her dog was trying to tell her. The town could laugh all they wanted. They could call her paranoid, eccentric, crazy. She'd spent her entire adult life trusting her instincts in the wild, learning to listen to the signals others missed. And right now, every fiber of her being told her that something was terribly, dangerously wrong beneath that bridge. Whatever was hidden there, Elara Finch was going to uncover it. Even if it meant standing alone against the ridicule and doubt of everyone she knew. Even if what she found beneath those stones proved more horrifying than anything she could imagine. The next morning, Elara woke before dawn with a sense of purpose that overrode her exhaustion. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. She dressed quickly in her work clothes, heavy canvas pants, a thermal shirt, and her waterproof jacket. From the shed behind her cabin, she gathered her equipment, a high-powered flashlight, rope, climbing gear, her hunting knife, and a small camera she used for documenting animal tracks. Casper watched her from the porch, his intelligent eyes tracking her every movement. When she moved toward her truck, he stood and whined softly. "Not this time, boy," she said gently, scratching behind his ears. "You stay here." She couldn't risk bringing him. Whatever had triggered his fear, she needed to investigate without worrying about his reaction. She left him with full water and food bowls, then drove the winding road toward the Greythorn Bridge as the sun began painting the peaks in shades of copper and gold. The forest was silent when she arrived, that peculiar stillness that comes just after dawn when even the birds seem to be holding their breath. Elara parked her truck on the shoulder and approached the bridge on foot, her boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. In the early light, the structure looked exactly as it always had, solid, ancient, unmoved by time. The stone slabs were dark with moisture, the wooden railings weathered but sturdy. The creek rushed below, its sound a constant white noise that had always been comforting. Until now. Elara walked onto the bridge slowly, testing each step, listening for anything unusual. The stones held firm. No creaking, no shifting. She reached the center and leaned over the railing, peering down at the water below. From this angle, she could see only rocks and rushing water, nothing out of the ordinary. But Casper's terror had been real. And dogs didn't lie. She needed to get underneath. Deeper investigation. Elara made her way down the steep embankment on the northern side of the bridge, using exposed roots and rocks as handholds. The descent was treacherous, the ground slick with moss and morning dew. More than once, her boots slipped, and she had to grab onto vegetation to keep from tumbling into the creek. When she finally reached the water's edge, she was breathing hard, her hands scratched and dirty. The creek was louder here, the sound of rushing water filling her ears. She clicked on her flashlight and waded carefully into the shallow edges, the icy water soaking through her boots immediately. The underside of the bridge stretched above her like a stone ceiling, dark and covered in decades of moss and mineral deposits. She swept her flashlight beam across the surface slowly, methodically, searching for anything unusual. At first, she saw nothing. Just stone, timber supports, and the natural accumulation of debris that collected around any structure built over water. Spider webs glistened in her light. Small fish darted away from her boots. Then her light caught something. A discoloration on one of the main support beams, a dark stain that didn't match the rest of the weathered wood. Elara stepped closer, her heart beginning to pound. The stain was irregular, spreading across the beam like spilled liquid that had dried and darkened over time. She reached up and touched it carefully. The wood felt different here, softer, almost spongy, as if whatever had soaked into it had begun to rot the timber from within. Her flashlight moved further along the beam, and that's when she saw it. Scratches. Deep, deliberate scratches carved into the wood, forming patterns that were definitely not natural. They looked almost like letters. Or symbols. Crude and hasty, as if someone had clawed them there in desperation. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She moved her light more frantically now, examining the other beams, the stone pillars, the underside of the bridge deck itself. More marks. More stains. And then, her light fell on something wedged between two stones in the bridge's foundation. Something that made her stomach turn cold. Fabric. Torn, rotted fabric that might have once been clothing. Entangled within it, partially hidden by shadow and decay, something that looked sickeningly like. Elara stumbled backward, splashing in the creek, her flashlight beam shaking violently. Her mind reeled, refusing to process what her eyes had just seen. She steadied herself against a rock, forcing her breathing to slow, forcing herself to look again. It wasn't her imagination. There was something, someone, wedged into the foundation of the bridge. Mockery intensifies. Elara scrambled back up the embankment, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip her phone. She stood on the road beside her truck, staring at the bridge, trying to decide what to do. She needed to call Sheriff Drummond. She needed to report this immediately. But doubt crept in. What if she was wrong? What if it was just debris, animal remains, her mind playing tricks because she'd been so focused on finding something, anything, to explain Casper's behavior? She thought of the town's reaction, the mockery she'd already endured. If she called the sheriff and it turned out to be nothing, she'd never live it down. They already thought she was paranoid, unhinged. This would confirm every whispered joke, every dismissive comment. Her finger hovered over the call button, then withdrew. She needed to be sure. Absolutely certain. She spent the next hour documenting everything with her camera, taking dozens of photos from every angle she could manage. The scratches, the stains, the fabric. Her hands were still shaking, making some of the images blurry, but she captured enough. When she finally drove back to town, her mind was a chaos of fear and uncertainty. She stopped at Brennan's Market for coffee, trying to calm her nerves, trying to think clearly. Inside, she ran into Tom Whitlock, one of the local hunting guides and her biggest professional rival. He was standing near the coffee machine with two other men, and when he saw her, a slow grin spread across his face. "Well, if it isn't Ravenhollow's famous dog whisperer," he said loudly. "How's your bridge-phobic mutt doing, Elara?" The other men chuckled. One of them, a logger named Dutch, added, "Maybe you should get him one of those emotional support vests. Or therapy. Or maybe," Tom continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "you should stop projecting your own fears onto that poor animal. Spending too much time alone in the woods isn't healthy, you know." Elara's jaw tightened. She wanted to tell them what she'd found, wanted to wipe those smug grins off their faces. But without confirmation, without proof that would hold up under scrutiny, they'd only mock her more. So she paid for her coffee in silence and left. External crisis emerges. 2 days later, the town was shaken by news that sent ripples of fear through every household in Ravenhollow. A young woman named Sophie Hendricks, a 23-year-old who'd moved to town 6 months earlier to work at the ranger station, had been reported missing. She'd gone hiking alone 3 days ago and never returned. Her car was found at the Graythorn trailhead, the trail that crossed the bridge. Search parties were organized immediately. Sheriff Drummond called for volunteers, and nearly every able-bodied person in town showed up. Elara joined them, of course. This was what she did best, tracking, searching, finding the lost. But as the teams fanned out across the forest, moving in coordinated grids, calling Sophie's name into the vast wilderness, Elara felt a growing dread settling in her chest like ice. The Graythorn Bridge. Sophie would have crossed it on her hike. Everyone did, it was the only way through to the northern trails without adding hours to the journey. Elara found herself gravitating toward the bridge during the search, though her team was assigned to a different sector. She stood at its entrance, staring at the solid stones, thinking of what lay beneath. Thinking of the fabric, the scratches, the dark stains. Casper's terror suddenly made horrifying sense. Crisis deepens. Days passed. The search continued, growing more desperate with each passing hour. Volunteers trudged through the forest in increasingly hopeless sweeps. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Tracking dogs were brought in from neighboring counties, their handlers working them along every trail, every creek bed. But Sophie Hendricks remained missing. The town began to fracture under the strain. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she'd run away, fleeing a bad relationship no one knew about. Others whispered about wild animals, about the dangers of hiking alone. A few, mostly older residents who remembered darker times, spoke in hushed voices about the bridge, about old stories that had been dismissed as legend. Elara listened to all of it, her resolve hardening. She knew something the others didn't. Something they'd dismissed and mocked her for investigating. On the 5th day of the search, she made her decision. She would go to Sheriff Drummond. She would show him the photos, tell him what she'd found beneath the bridge. Even if they laughed at her, even if they dismissed her again, she couldn't stay silent any longer. A woman was missing. And Elara was convinced the answer lay in the shadows beneath those ancient stones. Silent preparation. That evening, Elara sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, reviewing every photo she'd taken. She organized them chronologically, made notes, prepared herself for every question and objection the sheriff might raise. Casper lay at her feet, unusually restless. Every few minutes, he'd lift his head and stare toward the door, as if sensing her anxiety, as if knowing they were approaching something dangerous. "You tried to warn me, didn't you?" she whispered to him. "You knew something was wrong." The dog's dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw an intelligence that went beyond training or instinct. He'd known. From the very first morning. And now, finally, she was ready to listen. As darkness fell over Ravenhollow and the forest outside her windows turned black, Elara made one final decision. Tomorrow morning, before going to the sheriff, she would return to the bridge one last time. She would document everything more thoroughly, would search more carefully, would gather evidence that even the most skeptical person couldn't dismiss. Because deep in her bones, Elara knew that whatever horror lay beneath the Greythorn Bridge, it was about to be dragged into the light. And when it was, the town that had mocked her would understand that her dog's fear had been the truest warning of all.